The technique I want to show you right now is to speed up the time it takes to adjust material layers based on slope. It's just how to create a slope evaluation layer that can go on top of your existing material layers and can be turned on and off pretty easily. So I just have a terrain in the scene right now, and at the moment it only has one material. But if I want to start putting additional materials on it and limit them based on slope, rather than rendering it out, seeing what it looks like, and then adjusting it over and over again to get what it is I'm looking for, we're going to create a quick layer, or a slope evaluation layer, render that out, and then we can use that in order to adjust the slope. So I'm going to go ahead and close out this render, and we're going to select just the terrain and its material. Currently it's only one layer, so when I add an additional layer it could possibly modify the scaling of the current layer. So we just need to pay attention to what the current scale is, which is 0.01 in a world parametric mode, and that's because my scene scale and the way my units and coordinates are set up, it's a 1 meter view unit, and the scene itself, if we take a look in relation to the grid, it's somewhat smaller, but the way the material was designed, this material, it does require something a little bit smaller. So we're going to go back, and now I'm going to add a layer, and I'm just going to hit the X in order to create a blank material layer. Now the main material and the overall material scale for every layer is going to be modified by this top scale. So I do want to set this to 1. Go back down to the green and brown rock, which is my initial layer, and change that back to 0.01. And that will preserve our scale so that any additional layers that are added can keep their normal scale without being modified. If you do want to modify everything, then you can change that top layer, which is currently called default. So I'm going to change the scale of this to 1. Now really the scale shouldn't affect this layer whatsoever. I'm going to rename it slope. And it shouldn't be affected because we are going to be connecting to the slope function, and I'm going to go over into the environment tab where we have an altitude range currently set, and just make it all the way open so that the altitude goes down to -1 and it's not being clipped out at all. So what we want to use is a color production in order to display the slope, which means there's a lot of different ways we can create an evaluation layer that, and really it's going to be whatever is going to help you the best. And we want to set this up first, setting up the color before we go ahead and connect it to slope. So the current color, the first color, is going to be the area in the flat area zones. So let's edit this color, and I'm going to use an RGB value, which is going to be 0 for the green and blue, and 255 for the red. So that's going to be a completely red color for the flat areas and the areas with no slope. We can create another key point, which we're going to want positioned at 0. So if it was a little bit off, you can just change its position to 0. And we're going to edit the color and make this a blue. So 0 for the red, 0 for the green, and 255 for the blue. So now we're going to have a gradient that fades between red and blue, going from no slope whatsoever to a 90-degree slope, so a very vertical area. And anything below is going to be, or only show up on objects or terrains. In the case of terrains, it would have to be a 3D terrain that would have an overhang. Or using a twisted terrain object, which would be the skewing parameters located under the numerics tab, and then the twist, which is really just a skew and allow you to skew the terrain. Other than that, unless you have like a sphere object, we're not really going to see those other areas of slope. So if you want, you can set up a color for the lowest point, which we can also set to red, or you could use green, really anything you want, and set its position to -1. Now if you want to have any in-between colors, you would want to set them up now. This is a layer we'll be able to use over and over again whenever you need to render out slope and really take a look at it. It will be more useful to have an additional key point and an additional color to evaluate the slope. So we're going to create another key point, which is going to be at 0.5, and the color is going to be green. So 0 on the red, 0 on the blue, and 255 for the green. Set our position to 0.5. And we can do the same thing for the -0.5 value. And just type that in. So now we can use this color reference in order to figure out exactly where the slope is at. So I'm going to edit the function, and we now need the slope control. So we're going to take the connection from this constant node of 0 up to the slope. And in order to make sure that the atmosphere is not interfering with the material, in order to be able to create an accurate render that can be used to pull out the color samples and really figure out where what the slope angle is at, what we can do is ignore the atmosphere and the lighting and not render it out. And it does look like something went wrong because everything is showing as blue. So I'm going to just go back to the material and take a look. And it does look like, for some reason, my map was modified. Also, my connections were removed. So I'm going to have to reset this up. Not quite sure why that happened. We'll go ahead and set it up again and see. Maybe I didn't click OK and clicked the X by accident. So I'm just going to reset this up. But once the color production is created again, we can save out the color map so that we don't have to do it again in case there is an issue. So the color map is finished and back to where it was before. I'm going to right click and save the color map and just call this slope eval. And that way I can load that in at any time when I want to either fix a material or when I'm done, I'm planning on just saving out the material layer. I am going to go back to the color production and reconnect to the slope. Make sure I click OK. Look at a preview. Click OK again. Edit the material. And I should be able to ignore lighting and atmosphere. And then render it out. So now we can use this reference in order to figure out what slope settings we need to get the material where it is we want it. We can tell that most of the colors are pretty much consistent on this terrain because I do have a strata material. So we have a lot of flatter areas, which is where the red point is showing up. Now, if you want to get the most accurate output, you will need to turn off the natural film response. And depending how your gamma is set, I've got my set to 1. but most of these settings are not enabled. I'm going to go ahead and turn them all on. I'm not using a texture, so I don't need to worry about the texture. And I'm going to close this out and re-render it. The natural film response will prevent color peaking, and at this point we don't want that to happen because we want to do good or have a good evaluation layer. And these typically render very quickly because they're ignoring lighting and atmosphere. The only thing that needs to be calculated in this case is the geometry of the procedural terrain. So if we do want an exact point to be able to pick out, what we can do is save this out. And I'm going to save this as a TIFF file, and I'm also going to override the gamma. The reason I'm going to override the gamma, and these gamma settings are just for users using View 8.5 or higher. Previous versions don't have this setting, but my gamma control has a texture input and output of 2.2. So saving a picture, it will save a gamma of 2.2, and I want to override that to the gamma of 1, which is the view standard, and it will show and save exactly the way we're viewing the picture. Otherwise, it's going to be a lot brighter, and in this case, it's not going to work very well. So we'll save that out. I can close this, and I'm going to open this up in a program where I can sample the colors in different areas and get an exact slope evaluation and really see what's what. So I've gone ahead and opened the render in Photoshop where we have an info readout. This is for just kind of the hover mode, being able to look at the info and see what the RGB value is. And since we have the individual color set up, with red being the lowest amount of slope, the flattest, blue being the highest, and then green is in between, we can look at the individual RGB values and really see what the slope is going to turn out to be. Now, the other render I have opened is with the gamma set to 2.2. And also with the auto exposure turned off, because the auto exposure did make it a lot brighter. So in this case, it might even give a slightly better representation of what the slope is. And it's really going to depend on your monitor that you're using for at least how it looks visually. The readout itself, since we are using direct RGB values, it's going to really give us probably the best idea of how the slope is going to be laid out. So what we really kind of need is a key to set up the color map in relation to the slope to see exactly what values need to be what and what to really see how we would modify this. And if you do want to pick out a specific zone, you can use the eyedropper tool, making sure it's set to point sample for a specific point. Otherwise, you can use more of a ranged sample, which is the different averages that will take the pixels and kind of add them together and create an average. But otherwise, you can just click and then get that color and see exactly what the RGB value is in that specific point area. So once we're in view, there's a couple of different ways we can control the slope of materials. And I do want to note that we can now turn off this slope layer. So we can edit the function, and the easiest way is just to add a constant number node of -1 and connect that to the alpha. So that's going to return no transparency and keep it on. And if we set it to 1, it will be completely transparent, and then it's turned off. We'll also need to make sure that that ignore lighting and atmosphere is turned back on in order for the material to show up. Since we don't have an additional material at the moment, we'll need to, I'm going to go ahead and add in another layer so we can take a look at the Effects tab, or the Environment tab. So I'm going to add a layer, and I'm just going to add a dirt layer. Go over to the Environment tab, and we have our slope range, which is a value between -1 and 1. And that's going to correspond exactly the same way as the color map was set up. So 0 to 1 is basically what we're seeing right now, since we don't have any areas of slope going below 0. So 0 represents 0, or actually 0 represents what would be a 90-degree slope, and then 1 is equal to 0, and then -1 is also equal to 0, but in the other direction. So what would be underneath the terrain. So we can use this slider in the Environment tab to control the slope output, and then the fuzziness options are basically a bit of blurring, or sort of a Gaussian on the flatter and steeper areas. So we can use that to control the slope, or we can control our alpha of the material by using a couple of different options. One way that I like to control slope is with a color map. It just requires a tiny bit of setup. What we can do is add in a color map node by selecting Add a Color node, making sure it's set to color map. We can then edit the color map, and I'm going to go ahead and set my lowest point to 0 and create a color RGB 0 all the way across, and then just make sure that that first point is 255. Click OK. We can connect this to slope, and then we need to right-click, add a math node, conversion, color to brightness. So it's going to convert that black and white value to a brightness value, -1 to 1, and we can control our alpha, so connecting the alpha to the color to brightness. And now we can modify the slope with a color map. So this is pretty cool. Black is going to be where the material is not showing, and white is going to be where the material is showing. So if we were to constrain this and bring our lowest point to 0.5, the material is going to show with no transparency on the flattest areas, and then start to fall off as gradient down to the 45-degree. If we want a sharper cutoff, we can add another key point, set it to 255 for white, and now it's going to show with no transparency up till where we have a point of 0.65, and then the complete fall off is around 0.5, so then it'll be a gradient from these two areas. So you could also set up an additional color map to be able to compare it, just kind of looking at it. But for the most part, you kind of have an idea in mind of where it's showing. And you can even look right now where I have the color not updated in the main material, and that shows exactly which points are what, where the colors are. So this is a cool way to be able to control the slope and adjust where the material is showing. And I have run into a little bit of a bug within 8.5. I believe I saw it in 8.4 as well, where clicking OK becomes grayed out, or you can't click any of the buttons. So if you need to, you can hit Enter to close that out and apply the changes to the material. And now we can see the material showing up from 0 degrees to just about 45 degrees, and everything after that is going to show the material that was previously there underneath it. Another way we could control the slope even still using the color map, is what we can do is go into the color map, and we have an opacity filter. This will allow us to create the slope evaluation and even contain some of those points, although not in the same places. In this case, we do have a few points already added. And this way we can use a filter. Click OK. See a preview within the color map, and then connect to the standard numeric output and see how that's showing. We do have a little bit of gradient fall off. Go back, edit the color map, edit the filter, and that's because it appears to not have saved my point setting that I had. And it looks like there's just a couple of bugs I'm running into at the moment, unfortunately. I'm going to go back. Yeah. We can edit the filter, edit the map. And it looks like clicking off of it did apply my changes, which is good. But this way we can just use that opacity filter in order to work just the same way as the color map can. So that way, if you wanted to, you could use the color map that we used for the evaluation with the different colors and modify the opacity filter in order to modify that. And you can see that it is causing that issue once again. So maybe that might not be the best way in the current version in order to modify it. Color brightness works pretty well. Otherwise, you can just use a direct filter, which would be to connect the alpha directly to the slope and then add in a filter. And we can then modify the filter this way. It does change the numeric values a little differently, but we should be able to achieve basically the same results. And then I am going to set the clamping modes to clamp instead of continue, because we don't want anything going outside the bounds, but this should be able to produce basically the same effect. So now, even though I didn't match the points exactly, it will basically look the same as it did before, because it's very close to the same values. So a lot of different ways to use the slope to control the appearance on the material. If you did want to have transparency throughout and no point where it's going to show the full texture and somewhat show the material underneath, then you would just need to use values that were going to be lower than 1 for the highest points. So we could go a little bit lower, and that way it would be somewhat transparent on the top. And the same thing goes for the color map that's set up. So we could modify the color map that way. Right now the opacity filter is going to need to be modified so that we can see the color. Still having a small problem here with the filters. I just hit enter to close that out. But now if we wanted to set up that transparency sort of the same way, we can just modify the color so it's not white, make it a little more gray, and that will add additional transparency. Making sure, of course, that we do connect that to the color to brightness output, because the numeric output automatically produced by the color map is going to be based on the input somewhat, but mainly it is going to be directly connected to that filter. So if the filter is set to no transparency whatsoever, the output is going to be basically null and not produce the same thing. So if we click on that output, we can see it's just black. because the filter is not allowing anything to show through. So that's why the color to brightness with that color map together can make a pretty cool slope controller. That can also be used to blend nodes together directly within any material. Instead of just connecting it directly to an alpha, you could control between different color variations by using it as a ratio of a blender node. So that will also work. A lot of different things we could do with it. You could also create a meta node out of it. If you wanted to reuse this over and over again, just select both of these nodes, create a meta node, and then if we edit it, we can go in and publish the color map. And automatically get an output that is already converted to be able to edit the color, create those changes, and not have to worry about adding any additional nodes. So it's already set up. So then you could save out the meta node loaded in at any time to have a numerically controlled color map, or a color map that controls the output, the numeric converting color over to a numeric value.